This is an IWP Media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. To learn more, visit iwp.edu.
Welcome to the IWP Podcast in national security matters, and specifically counterintelligence. My name is John Quattrocki, and I'm a professor here at IWP on faculty for more than 15 years, teaching a 4-course curriculum in counterintelligence and national security matters. And I'm joined today by Paul Kepp, a new member of the faculty and a former senior member of the CIA's Senior Executive Service. Paul, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, John. Yes, my name is Paul Kepp. I am new on the faculty here at IWP, just about a year. Before that, I spent about 3 decades in the CIA, specifically in the Directorate of Operations. That is on the clandestine side. Most of that career I spent overseas in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Great experience. Counterintelligence is key to everything that the agency does, and it's a privilege to be here today with John, who can bring the domestic and FBI perspective to this key issue.
Thanks, Paul. When we met last time with Dean Robbins, sitting in that seat instead of Paul, we had a sense from the Hill and from the new incoming Trump administration that there might be changes afoot with regard to the U.S. counterintelligence program. And in fact, that's turned out to be the case. The Senate and the House have both presented drastically different visions for what counterintelligence is going to look like going forward in U.S. national security interest. We have had some insight into those deliberations, particularly on the House side, and in many cases, they drew heavily on work we did almost a quarter of a century ago when I was on the NSC staff in the Intelligence Directorate after 9/11 and after the arrests of Ames, Pitts, Nicholson, Hansen, and the revelations of the China program with the 95 walk-in, and soon-to-be-realized revelations in our Cuban program. So we were called in to share the work we had done in response to President Bush's NSPD-5, which called for a complete review of the counterintelligence program, and then Executive Order 13328, which created the Silberman-Robb Commission, whereby we took the work from NSPD-5, rolled it into the work of the executive order, and on March 31st, 2005, issued a final report for the commission, wherein in chapters 10 and 11, we redefined what counterintelligence and domestic intelligence, that is intelligence at home in the United States, might look like. That work wound up with the approval of the president and then probably lied on a shelf, quite frankly, for 20 years, to be resurrected about 3 years ago by interests up on the Hill. And we've been called in to share our thoughts on the deliberations that led to those determinations and then recommendations to the president for substantially changing the way the U.S. government might conduct its U.S. counterintelligence program. The problem with the effort from 25 years ago was that it, like the reviews and revisions before it, were done in an era of, or in a spirit of, recent mistakes bordering on disasters on the part of the counterintelligence community, which wound up in bad headlines, bad feelings on the Hill, feeling of mistrust in the taxpaying public with regard to the U.S. counterintelligence program. What we have today is the very real possibility that for the first time in over 100 years, the president and the Congress will cause changes to be made in the U.S. counterintelligence program that aren't born of a most recent mistake. They are born out of a sincere effort to substantially change and make more effective the way the United States government conducts its counterintelligence program. We have participated in some of those deliberations by sharing with the committees and with others in the administration some of our initial determinations with regard to urban legend, mythology, mistaken impressions with how and why and towards what end we conducted counterintelligence in the past. So what Paul and I are going to do today is sit from or in the positions we occupied previously in our government employment and shred or tear apart U.S. counterintelligence program as it was previously, and as we imagine, if we can read the legislation correctly, as we imagine the government might come to reshape it once the government comes back to work. As you know, we're speaking to you now during the period of the government shutdown, which of course will push everything back on the calendar.
So the question is before we get to the present, in the current debate that's going on, counterintelligence, it's a fundamental function of any intelligence community. And that's just about every country in the world has that in some form or another. And maybe we could talk a little bit later about some of the differences between countries. But taking maybe World War II as a starting point, how has counterintelligence evolved, in your view, from that time period up to the present?
Well, it's the right question. As we all know in our profession and in our faculty lives here, U.S. national security really starts formally in 1947. Prior to 1947, we don't agree to having a peacetime intelligence or national security framework. And so it is pretty much left to J. Edgar Hoover as pick your poison, the first DNI, the first DCI, certainly the fifth director of the FBI, but the first that took on the national security role. And it's Hoover's personality, it's Hoover's version or vision of U.S. national security that takes us right up to 1947 when the CIA is created and the Congress, for the first time, weighs in on what national security in peacetime should look like. So in 1947, with the National Security Act, we have a version of counterintelligence that is cautioned by two dynamics, two valences. One is, how do you keep a counterintelligence enterprise that cut its spurs in wartime? How do you keep them engaged in peacetime, but in peacetime environment with U.S. persons, not enemies, to be countered? So that became the first issue. Second issue was, we were then at that time dealing with the extraordinary advantage of and disadvantage of electronic surveillance. Electronic surveillance in the United States had been around about as long as Alexander Graham Bell had invented the telephone or the telegraph before that with Morse. And the government had been wiretapping since the Civil War and had been wiretapping with some abandon. The problem is, if you are wiretapping for, say, a wartime effort or a non-counter-espionage investigation or operation, then you're pretty much left to the whim of the White House. That is, the president, acting with his Article II authority as commander-in-chief, can, on his own stroke of his own pen, order wiretaps to be conducted. And as you know, that's exactly what happens in May 20th of 1940. President Roosevelt writes a page-and-a-half memo directing the director of the FBI to continue to wiretap a recent Supreme Court decision, Nardone, and a recent act of Congress, the Federal Communications Act of 1934, notwithstanding. Now, that's an extraordinary advantage for the conduct of wiretaps in the interest of the broader national security. But it presented us with an enormous problem when it came to counterespionage. And this is a theme that ran through the investigation we did for 5 years per NSPD 5 and Executive Order 13328. The inability to formally distinguish between counterespionage and counterintelligence ran us into some roadblocks downrange when we tried to take cases initially started as counterintelligence operations and then mold them into counterespionage investigations. The big distinction being, in a counterespionage case, we have two judges outside of our control. We got the judge, in fact, sitting, presiding over the trial. We got a jury of 12. And to them, we have to present evidence in keeping with the rules of evidence. And one of those requires that you show your work in all things. By discovery, a subject of an espionage case is entitled to that. In this case, where many of these cases were begun because of Venona, and we should probably stop here and make sure we're bringing the audience along with us.
Sure.
Venona utterly awful, extraordinarily effective, but conducted without a judicial warrant, conducted with executive authority. President Roosevelt had authorized it, President Truman had continued it, and presidents since then have relied on their Article II commander-in-chief authority to go ahead and command that electronic wiretapping continue. However, when the product of that wiretap, as was the case in Venona, when the product of that wiretap has to find its way into a public trial with the press and the family and the friends of the accused in the courtroom, the government is required to show all of its work, not just the work that's convenient.
And that never happened with Venona, right? It remained secret all the way up until, if I recall correctly, the 1990s, when the U.S. government made the decision to release the material.
Not only are you right, fascinatingly, it wound up in some of the great early Cold War stories of all time. Whether by providence or manipulation, we're not sure. There is the case that Venona, being worked by Army Security Agency and now the FBI, come upon their first identification from a decryption to a decoding to a true name identification of who they believed was the first spy identified as working on the Manhattan Project. And I'm sure Hoover was happy to hear this, as was the United States Army. It was not an American, but it was a Brit. And not only was it not a Brit, it was a German who had become a Brit, Klaus Fuchs. And so the very first case we tried to make with electronic surveillance information, whereby we could not disclose the fact there was electronic surveillance information, was the Klaus Fuchs case, codenamed Rest in the Venona traffic.
So that's Venona. Interesting, important historical example of wiretapping of a sort that went on in the World War II and post-World War II era. But before we jump ahead to the late 1970s,
right,
when changes to the law took place that governed national security wiretapping, how was it in fact done? In criminal cases, everybody knows the FBI and other police agencies require a warrant to do that. That kind of procedure with its disclosure obligations isn't going to work in a spying case. So how did the FBI do it between, say, 1947 and 1978?
So this becomes the crux of not a problem, but a real challenge. And it's one of those inside baseball perspectives that if you weren't in the Department of Justice or the FBI, I was in the FBI, and there were those in the FBI that disabused anybody of the notion we were actually part of the Department of Justice. But in fact, that's true. So what typically happens on all espionage cases, so I won't even say typically, universally happens on all espionage cases. The Attorney General signs off on all espionage cases. There aren't that many. I dare say you'd be hard-pressed to find one in the last 2 years. In the heydays in the 80s, we'd have 15 and 16 a year for about 10 years. But espionage cases are small enough of a number that all of them are reviewed by the Attorney General. And when you brief to the Attorney General on the case, you have to present them with all the mitigating factors you might have to present at court. So in the case of all the espionage cases we might have made from 1947, as you said, to 1978, the passage of the FISA Act, many of those were turned down by the Department of Justice as having no prosecutive merit. Didn't mean they had no investigative merit, but DOJ would say, you've done your job in the investigation. We can't take that into a public courtroom because we will not disclose the wiretap. But in not disclosing the wiretap, we can't establish the predicate for the investigation. And so, of course, using a term everybody's familiar with, fruit of the poison tree, we don't have a tree to grow. So we would get, very formally, a written declination of prosecution from the DOJ. Now, that sounds like an inside baseball term, and it is. Every espionage case presented to the Department of Justice results in a formal reply by letter back across the street. It's the longest 120 feet in Washington, from DOJ to the Hoover building at the FBI headquarters. And they would give us a formal declination. Given the totality of facts in this case, DOJ is declining to prosecute this case, which then is not the end of the road. It would actually release us then to examine one of the other three outcomes of a full-blooded counterintelligence program, whether it's the United States or Britain, the NATO allies. Counterespionage, that is, counterespionage or counterintelligence for a disruptive purpose only is not the only objective of a full-throated counterintelligence program. You have the false flag program, you have the double agent program, you have the global targeting and recruitment program, and you've got a counterespionage program. Once DOJ would formally notify the FBI that there was not an espionage case to be made, we could then turn to any of the other three outcomes. And so you'd find oftentimes in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, cases that might have gone to court under different circumstances now become ripe for double agent operations. And so you had this balance in an unforecasted, unanticipated kind of way. You have this balance of counterintelligence outcomes not slaved to or lashed exclusively to a counterespionage outcome.
Sure. And we should probably distinguish here, there's a difference between the dynamic that you're describing with counterintelligence, counterespionage investigations against U.S. citizens, usually in the United States, and the larger signals intelligence or SIGINT program of the U.S. intelligence community. And at the risk of oversimplifying, we can say, if you're a U.S. citizen or a U.S. person, you have rights and you have protections. If you're not, the intelligence community has a great deal more latitude in terms of the information that it can collect secretly and clandestinely in support of the U.S. national security mission.
Right. So our counterintelligence program is fine-tuned against the foreign national working in the United States, usually with diplomatic cover. Circumstance you're probably not unfamiliar with, right? And they enjoy a different protection by U.S. laws and Constitution than the agent of a foreign power, typically a U.S. person, working in access to U.S. secrets and committing the act of espionage.
So can you clarify that a little bit? Even a foreign embassy here in the United States with non-U.S. persons, non-U.S. citizens working here, including intelligence officers working in the United States under diplomatic cover, surely the FBI doesn't face many restrictions in collecting on them.
We don't. The one exception being, of course, in the 20th and 21st century, every building in Washington has a telephone. And just like phones in U.S. installations overseas, the person typically calling in is somebody from that community. And we'll get that here. People want to apply for work visas, study visas, travel visas to any one of a number of countries. When they call in, we have a U.S. person calling in on a publicly available line. Even though they're calling into a foreign establishment, it is in fact a U.S. person calling in. And so we will afford FISA protection, that is, getting a FISA order to cover certain of the commercially available lines so that we aren't accused of or guilty of backing into coverage of a U.S. person, employing authorities more normally ascribed to a foreign intelligence officer.
So let's talk about FISA then, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was passed in 1978. Why that came about and how it changed not just the FBI's, but the entire intelligence community's approach to this kind of technical collection. I think it's safe to say that this grew out of the scandals of the mid-1970s involving the CIA and the FBI in terms of intelligence activity in the United States, sometimes against U.S. citizens and U.S. organizations, and the changes that came about as a result of that. One of those, of course, was greatly increased congressional oversight. Before the mid-1970s, Congress was generally content, I'll speak for the CIA here more than the FBI, was generally content to let the CIA do its operations, undertake its activities, the vast majority of which were overseas in pursuit of U.S. national security interests. But those mid-70s scandals changed the political dynamic, resulted in the creation of the intelligence committees in the Senate and the House, and much stronger legislative oversight. FISA, too, and the changes in the laws on wiretaps were part of that, too. Maybe you can explain how that affected the Bureau.
Yeah. So it becomes one of the great, a lot of this is mechanics and it's policy and it's procedural. Some of it's very personal. And one of, as you're probably aware from your side of the river, one of the personal mythologies to roll out of the 50s into the 60s and the 70s was this strange tension between J. Edgar Hoover and Jim Angleton.
Right.
And out of that, unrebutted by the government and frankly unexamined properly by the press, out of that came this notion that either Angleton acting individually or Hoover acting individually, but certainly neither of them really coordinating with the White House or running their own version of counterintelligence in the U.S. government, among the U.S. persons, and frankly overseas in some cases, with absolutely no agreement on the part of the White House. Couldn't be further from the truth. Couldn't be further from the truth. Hoover at every step along the way. And there's a number of examples, and we can get into some other time, which really lends to a different mythology about Hoover and the respect and or fear the White House showed him. But in fact, the CIA and the FBI had continued to wiretap in the United States, not because they were wildcatting their counterintelligence program, but because they had very specific guidance, first from President Roosevelt, reaffirmed or affirmed by every succeeding president, to include, which has been commonly misunderstood, the counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, in 1956, was agreed to by the Eisenhower NSC in 1956. In March of 1956, there's a meeting in the NSC. They approve COINTELPRO. Hoover institutes it in August of 1956, and off it runs until the middle 70s.
Right.
With it came the wiretap program. Okay. There was, as I said earlier, a mythology that grew up around that Hoover was wiretapping people on his own with no direction or approval from the White House. Could not be further from the truth. And I'll conclude it here with one of the strongest recommendations I can provide to you and anybody else watching here. When the Church Committee, to which you referred to earlier, when the Church Committee convenes in January, and then Church in January of 75, and then the Pike Committee, the NEDSI Committee in February 95, and then it becomes the Pike Committee 4 months later in June of 75. When the public hearings begin in the summer and fall of 75, Chairman Church, Frank Church, gets up there and basically throws the Congress under the bus. He said, this is not a mistake of the FBI. It's not a mistake of the CIA. It's not a mistake of the NSA or the Army only. This is on all of us. In fact, 6 presidents since Roosevelt had authorized wiretaps, and we didn't look for it. We never had an oversight committee, which of course then would lead to the creation of the HIPSI and the SISI a couple of years later. But he put it on everybody, and C-SPAN has it on its website to this day. You can see Frank Church's opening statement, and he acknowledges that the counterintelligence program with the wiretaps and the black bag jobs, sometimes all your wiretaps can't be on a Bell telephone line. It has to be by a microphone. All those were in fact authorized. But we collectively, the national security community, had done a good job of hiding it from the press. You can keep secrets in Washington. I'm here to tell you, as I'm sure you know too. And so when the Church Committee opens up on this, the first thing they do is acknowledge the fact that far from being a wildcat operation, it was both better and worse than people had imagined. In fact, the whole government had been on board for the wiretap program. But that had precluded taking a lot of cases to court because of the restriction on the use of the probative material at trial in a public setting.
So FISA then comes about in 1978, and
Right.
Again, at the risk of oversimplifying, it's a process by which there's a special court. It's secret.
Right.
The FBI or the intelligence community can bring a case. I think it's mostly the FBI, if not entirely, can bring a case for a wiretap or some kind of special collection on a U.S. person or a U.S. entity if there's reasonable suspicion of espionage or some other activity contrary to U.S. national security.
Right. So you checked all the boxes. And as you know, we often correct students in our classes here, misused in almost all the newspapers that I can find, to include the New York Times. There is no such thing as a FISA warrant. And that's by design. That is not a mistake. When you get an order from the FISA court, the FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, up at the Perryman building there, just near Capitol Hill and away from FBI headquarters, you get a FISA order, not a FISA warrant. And there's a reason for that. And the reason goes back to the Fourth Amendment, right? If you go back to the Fourth Amendment, no issue shall warrant but for, and you can fill in the blanks from your con law days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So realizing we were trying to find a way in good faith to impose a probable cause standard on the collection by electronic means of information in the national security, they imported the theme, that doctrinal underpinnings of a court-ordered wiretap, but into the national security realm. And so it becomes known as a FISA order, which an agent would present to the FISA court up in the Perryman building, from which you would get an order which you could then pass to the field office conducting the investigation. The combination of that in 1978, and then 3 years later, President Reagan retooling the whole of the U.S. Intelligence Committee based principally on the findings of the Church Committee, and writing Executive Order 12333, wherein on page 1, at subparagraph C in the prelude says, special emphasis shall be given to countering espionage. So you have the tool in 78 to allow you to collect in a legal manner such you could present at court, and you got a president redirecting the previously multifaceted counterintelligence program into a, if not only, a primarily counterespionage-driven program. And so it is not by accident that we see, starting in 83, 84 is big, 85 is big, 86 is big, 15, 18, 20 espionage cases at a time. But it wasn't by accident, and it wasn't a wildcat operation on the part of anybody in the government. The president had given an order, and the whole National Security Committee had turned to that order, and counterespionage became first among equals within the larger counterintelligence program.
So I don't want to make this conversation entirely about the ins and outs of technical collection, although it's very important. But continuing just for another few minutes on this theme, FISA is basically still in place up to the present day. But what effect did I will call it two events in American history, important events. One was 9/11. And the second event, which very broadly speaking, I admit it's not an exact overlap, coincided with 9/11. And that was the rise of the internet and mobile telephony. Right. And how that affected America's technical collection mandate and capabilities when it comes to national security interests.
So that itself is the subject for another whole, not just broadcast, but a series of broadcasts, but written smaller than that for now. It presented us with two distinctly different challenges. One was the actual technical challenge. And so if you look back, you'll see in 1992, we convened something called CALEA, which was wiretapping for a law enforcement purpose because of the digitization of the communications, and with it, the inherent difficulties in cracking it. In the old days, when I was in Chicago and San Diego with the FBI, you go up a utility pole and you could actually, do the old alligator clips and a twisted pair of copper wire, right? But the Internet of Things and the elements that preceded that made it more difficult for us technically. And in the technical challenges, there then were some corresponding legal challenges because of accesses we had to gain that might not be provided willingly by any of the service providers. So that becomes its own issue. But additionally, in the early days, it was marginally easier because, and many people listening here won't recall these days, but at one point, the internet resided in space, not in fiber optical cabling. And in fact, for about 15 years, the United States Air Force was the executive agent for all cyber effects for U.S. government. Not just for the Air Force, but for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. Because in the old days, when the internet first popped up, it traveled via satellite signals. We did not have fiber optical cable as we have now lacing the whole planet. And so tapping into readily available radio waves was a little bit easier than trying to get under the water and tap into hardened and protected fiber optical cables.
Right.
So that became a real issue for us. And that then engendered a series of challenges legally because, going back to the old Silberman telegram days, in some ways, those lines that we had to attack might be transiting a server or a farm, a satellite farm, in a country not the United States, meaning we had not so much of a legal impediment, but we had a diplomatic problem by conducting intelligence activities in a sovereign state with whom we might be allies. And that becomes a real challenge. So as far back in history as the Zimmerman telegram seems, and it's over 100 years, in fact, carry it forward to where we are now. So that becomes a challenge. And you'll recall our generation, or your generation, mine, a generation older, in the early days, almost everybody had either a Microsoft, an MSN account, or a Hotmail account, or an AOL account. Those servers were typically here in the United States.
Yeah.
So we had, a convenient body of law and policy by which to gain access to those things. When the internet start transiting the world globally, and server farms or transition points or wires were coming out of the water on sovereign territory, not the United States, we had the challenge of either conducting intelligence activities in a foreign powers within their sovereign boundaries and either not telling them, which carries with it some diplomatic and or intelligence challenges for us, or telling them and running the risk then of it getting out. So it really does change with the internet starting in about 1988 until 2001. Of course, 2001 and 9/11 changes everything. Whatever the frailties of diplomatic and or intelligence relations are, as important as they were, kind of took a backseat to the immediacy of the post 9/11 environment and our need to get into the email accounts of terrorists that were in fact communicating by email on U.S.-owned domains, but having their messaging transiting perhaps in allies, sometimes in any case, other sovereigns. So that becomes, as I said, the grist for another whole broadcast, and it's fascinating.
This is the Patriot Act and everything
exactly
that flowed from that.
Yeah, and it puts into play fascinating, although maybe for you and me only, but not for others, information or terms like information at rest versus information in transit.
Metadata, all this kind of thing.
But if it's on a server, is that treated differently than if it's in transit?
Yeah.
And if it's on a server, where does the server reside? Can you get it when it's in transit with stuff traveling literally at the speed of light?
This was episode 1 of our Inside Counterintelligence series. Join us next time for episode 2. Our executive producers are Tim McCraner and Alfred Rickett. Editing and mastering was done by Olivia Fanders. If you like this podcast and would like to learn more about the topics we covered here today, and if you're interested in what it takes to become a student at IWP, visit iwp.edu and click Apply Now.